I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Michelle Dockery, who stars on Netflix's Anatomy of a Scandal. And Michelle, this whole show to me, there's a lot of elements of duality in this show, and I think your character specifically fits in with that. So, in tackling a character like this, do you start from the beginning in terms of taking on both parts of her, or do you just what were you initially attracted to?
Well, I was initially attracted to exactly that, the complexity of this woman, and that she's really living a lie in many ways. You know, she's changed her identity to bury her past. And I loved that there is this, fantastic kind of journey throughout the story for her, because she starts out as this quite sort of, closed off human being, and, very guarded. And then as the story goes on, those layers begin to peel back, and you discover, who she really is, or who she was. And also playing a barrister, I was really attracted and terrified by it at the same time. But the idea of playing a criminal barrister really drew me to the part. But duality is something that is it's such a prominent theme running through the whole thing. You're right. And S.J. Clarkson did this fantastic thing with mirrors on the cameras. It's like a prism where sometimes it shows two of Kate, or two of Sophie, and it's like the two lives kind of, and in Kate's case, it's the two people, it's Holly and her.
You also have, you talk about, playing a barrister, and I don't think there's a better writer for this type of stuff than David E. Kelley. So looking at those scripts, what is it about his writing you think that just kind of drew you in?
Well, he's really touched on something, I think, in recent years with Big Little Lies and The Undoing, in that it's stories about these seemingly perfect lives that implode. He's very good at that. and I guess when they discovered Sarah Vaughan's book of the same name, it fits really well with that type of theme, and he, as you say, he is very good at that. And I think that he and Melissa James Gibson navigated all of that so well in moving it from, the page to screen. I think it's something that we're all really drawn to at the moment. I certainly am. I mean, I was such a big fan of Big Little Lies and The Undoing, so it was a no-brainer to get on board with this. And also, not only David E. Kelley and Melissa James Gibson, but S.J. Clarkson, Bruna Papandrea, Liza Chasin, an incredible team were behind this. And when you have the whole package like that, a great part that you really want to get your teeth sunk into, but also, you're going into something with this incredible team at the helm of it all. It was fantastic. I couldn't wait to get stuck in.
Well, you talk about the layers of Kate, and I'm curious where you start building her. Which aspect of her was kind of like the first thing to develop with you?
Well, her appearance was really important. We had to establish who she was in the present day, and make her quite different from her who she is in the past. So that was something we had to tread very carefully with, which is why I ended up cutting all my hair. It was like my second day, and SJ walked into the hair and makeup trailer, and my hair was a kind of, similar color to this and a little longer. And she took one look at me and one look at the actress playing Holly, and we were just like, we need to do something drastically different. Either she has to do it or I have to do it. And so I just went for it. And that then I began to kind of see her. Sometimes the character, you have to really, take yourself out of it, and it has to be a slightly kind of more visual thing. And then really, it was a case of just throwing myself into it, because the way it was scheduled, we shot the verdict, the scene where Kate is in her flat and she's the verdict has just happened and she's watching the news and she essentially has this breakdown. That was like in my first 2 weeks of filming. So, and at first I thought, you know, I couldn't, it's so often the case is that you rarely ever film chronologically on anything, you know, because locations and there's all sorts of logistics that get in the way. So I didn't really know who that person was in the court until the end. But actually it worked out great, because I could get all of that rage and emotion out in those final moments with Kate, and then sort of work backwards. And I knew what was going on underneath because I'd already been there. There's a gift in that sometimes, that you play all of that first and then you know what's bubbling underneath. So in a way it worked out great. And I was quite isolated in the beginning. It was all of my scenes in the flat. I rarely saw Sienna and Rupert until we all got to the court, which felt like a party when we got there. Also shooting during COVID, we were very separated. So it was so nice seeing everybody. But for the character, that separation from everybody was really good, because she's a lone wolf, Kate. She's very private, and she likes to be alone. So it was good to kind of get into the character in that sense.
You talk about those scenes in the courtroom, and as a courtroom drama fan myself, I mean, there's so many layers in that, particularly episode 5, where she's kind of going at James, where you're going at Rupert Friend's character. And I'm curious, what was the biggest challenge of that scene? Because not only is it, there's so many layers to that scene, but also it's just an ocean of dialogue. So take us through that experience.
So I've played roles before where it requires a huge amount of dialogue learning. You have to do a lot of line learning. For this, it was so different, because as a prosecutor, you're asking questions and the answer doesn't necessarily give you a clue as to what your next question is going to be or your next line is going to be. Often in a scene, the other actor says, the character says a line and you go, I know what's coming now. Whereas with this, I would ask a question to, Kate asks a question to James or Olivia, and sometimes the answer is just no or yes. So I didn't have any, I would have to just have it all mapped out strategically. Like, what's my next move? Which is actually how I was coached through it with this fantastic criminal barrister here in London, who coached me through all of that process for 2 weeks. She was my coach. It was incredible. And so we would do the dialogue together over a Zoom, and she would sometimes read my role so that I could hear the intonations, how she would jump from one question to another, how she would try and derail James. So that was so useful for me, because it was like a dance, really. I had to kind of know what my next move was two beats before, or 3 lines before. So it was a big chat. That was, this is probably one of the biggest challenges of my career, really, was playing this role, and particularly those scenes in the court, because it required an incredible amount of concentration. So the preparation was just, I had to know those lines backwards. I would find myself walking my dog and going over my lines, and sometimes listening to them, on my AirPods, and people thought I was mad, just sort of talking to myself. But it was the only way. It had to be in my bones, because I didn't want her to falter, because she has to be like a laser,
In tackling this, you're also tackling a person who's been a victim of sexual violence. And you know, when we as the audience discover that in episode 4, it unlocks so many doors to the character. And I'm curious, as you were preparing this, what kind of preparation did you give to that particular facet of her?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of discussion beforehand. You know, it's obviously a subject that is a really sensitive one, and we were all adamant that it was delivered in the most authentic way possible. So we had a lot of information at our hands, you know, to tap into. I mean, so much of it for me was in the barriers that that Kate has put up for herself. It's a you know, that for me was one of the sort of keys into how someone might be affected by that type of trauma. So it was the breakthroughs that actually I found quite a relief, you know, to play, because there's just so much bubbling underneath, you know, and it's something that I sort of had to keep it in the back of my mind all the time, you know. And it was helpful in those scenes with Rupert where I was, you know, we didn't really see much of each other, but when I was in scenes with Rupert, it was, you know, I was reminded of what happened to her, you know. But we worked with Women's Aid here in the UK, who were so helpful. And there are some things that you just have to do your best to put yourself in those shoes and in that position. I mean, you know, it's impossible, I think, to really imagine, you know, what that must feel like. But I think with the help of the writers and, you know, what we had at our fingertips, we ended up with something that was, you know, as authentic as it could have been, you know, particularly for a character like Olivia, because, you know, my character doesn't really get to kind of talk about it. She doesn't actually, she kind of goes through it with her. There's a sort of parallel in those scenes, because what Olivia is saying is what Kate felt. So she's sort of reliving her trauma through Olivia. So Naomi and I had a real closeness there because, you know, the characters had been through something very, very similar.
Yeah, I always get different answers to this question. Was this a character that was easy to leave behind at the end of the day, or did it kind of hang on?
It's the scenes. It's more about the scenes that you play. I think, you know, whenever I do something that is sort of guttural and emotional, I go home and it's quite, you know, I'll feel tired and it is a little harder to shake off. So those scenes definitely were harder to you know, not to take home. And also the courtroom scenes were just constantly in my head. You know, I had to just keep running them. I used to put the script under my pillow at night with the hope that they would just sort of filter into my brain.
Like a sponge almost.
Yeah. But I've got better at that. You know, it's interesting. Like sometimes the body knows no different. If you're doing a scene that's really emotional, I think your body thinks that it's actually happening. So you have to find a way of just sort of shaking it off.
And yet I've also read that there was almost a lightness on the atmosphere of the set in between those really heavy moments. Was that crucial to making it come across?
Yeah, I think that levity is important, you know, on any job, but particularly when it's a subject that is so intense and dark at times. You know, when the camera is cut and SJ yells cut, sometimes it is good to just, you know, have a moment and a little bit of levity. And she was great at that, SJ. She's got such a great sense of humor, and they all do, actually. There's, you know, lots of giggling and stuff. But it's the courtroom, not so much of, though, because that, you know, those moments were so intense, and you could really hear a pin drop when Naomi Scott walked into the room for the first time and stood on the stand. And I thought, I can't imagine what that must feel like for someone who has been through that. So yeah, but you know, lightness is important, I think, in most jobs, you know, to have a little bit of, you know, we are making a show at the end of the day.
Well, and one of the things that I think is so fascinating is the use of flashbacks in this show, and the way they interject into certain moments. I'm curious, you know, in the script, I mean, what was it like filming that, knowing, was SJ telling you where the flashbacks were going to occur?
Yeah, so yes, but particularly in the courtroom, yeah. I mean, those scenes were really choreographed, you know, and she'd yell cut, and then she'd say, okay, now when you look to the right, this is where the flashback will be on the riverbank, you know, with Olivia and James. And so we would pause in between. And actually that gave me even more of a challenge, because it would break what felt like a tennis match sometimes. You know, I sometimes feel like acting is a bit like that. It's like you're hitting it back and forth to each other, and then sometimes you hit the net and it's like, oh. So sometimes that would happen when she had to put in the flashbacks. We'd have to stop, and I would just have to stay, almost like pretend that wasn't happening for me. I just had to stay laser focused in what I was doing. And Kate's not a character who looks down at her notes. Angela does. You know, there was a real difference in the two of them, in that Angela has a slightly more kind of relaxed approach, or seemingly looking like that. Whereas Kate she almost knows every single question. She doesn't even have to look down. So when she does falter, it's really noticeable that she might have, you know, dropped her guard or lost her train of thought.
One of my favorite shots is the final shot we see of Kate in that last episode, when the camera just kind of zooms in on her, and she's got this kind of like, you know, this look. I can only describe it as a look. And I'm curious, from an acting point of view, what was that look? What were you thinking during that moment?
Well, it's, you know, it starts off as quite like I'm thinking what I'm feeling, you know. So I you know, I would start by looking up when SJ says Michelle, and I had to look up. You know, there were various things that went through my head, like, I got him. You know, in a way, I mean, she's got, you know, eventually she does. There is some sort of justice, because he's about to go on another trial. But there's also there's a kind of confidence that she knows who she is now. So there was a bit of that. But then also it just gets very technical. So SJ's like, okay, look into the camera now. And so it's just like, I have to just make sure my head is absolutely central to the lens. So sometimes it's, you know, you can do something where you are so in it and so in the character, and you're feeling all the things that the character might be feeling. And then other times you can't really do that. It has to be so technical. And often they're the moments that sometimes come out even more authentic than when you were really overthinking it. You know, it's interesting.
Your career really, since what I love about following your career, especially after you've been on such a successful series, and you know, it's continuing with the movies and things like that. But do you intentionally seek out projects in the back of your mind, thinking about you know, moving away from Downton, and or is it just like, here's what this script brings to me?
Yeah, it for me, it all starts with the material. If I'm 10 pages in and I'm you know, already sort of saying the lines out loud, or you know, I'm gripped by it, I know I'm onto something. I mean, you'd be surprised. I don't get offered roles that are very similar to Lady Mary. They're always so different. And I think that's probably because, you know, if I walked onto Bridgerton, it's like Lady Mary's gone to the wrong house, like she's lost her direction. Do you know what I mean? I think I think creators out there are like, they can't have us in the same, in that period so much. It's too confusing. So, but there are definitely moments where I go, actually, I really want to do something like this. I actually just did a film called Boy Kills World, Sam Raimi film, which is it was so much fun, and it's action and this sort of mad dystopian film. And when that came through, it was a little more strategic. I was like, I really want to do something like this. And I loved it. It was so different. But it really depends on the material and who I'm working with. Yeah.
See, now you've just got me thinking about a Lady Mary showing up on Bridgerton. I just, now I can't get that out of my head. Michelle, congratulations. An absolute pleasure to talk to you. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout the season. Michelle Dockery, a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And you. Thanks so much, Tony.